So, and we do have this one last writer to talk about, Christine de Pizan. And I just want to start out by asking you, what kind of woman do you think could be an author during the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance? Christine her dates kind of crossed the line into the early Renaissance period. And she was, she's considered a French author, but she was born in Italy. What kind of woman would be able to, well, maybe a better way to ask this would be, why don't we have a lot of women authors from the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance period?
They weren't nobles.
What?
They weren't nobility. I mean, there were, but they just didn't have the same sort of political power presence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we do know that there were some female authors, but not as many as men by far during this time period. And you've mentioned that the nobility, a very small fraction of society, and typically speaking, if you were going to find a female author, it would be from that class, because they would be the ones who would be allowed an education, who would have the time, the leisure and the time, and maybe the tolerance amongst their family members or support to be able to do that. Okay, so nobles. Still few, because even amongst the noble class, there was, generally speaking, there was the notion that women were not well suited for intellectual activity, but it depended upon the family, and if in some families, if a very bright woman rose up and wanted to do these things, there wasn't any objection, and so in that case they were able to write poetry, write philosophic works and so forth. So occasionally, like during Hobbes's lifetime, which is the early modern period, he was supported by the family of William Cavendish. And Cavendish's wife, I think, Margaret, was an author, and she wrote several books, and she actually disputed with Hobbes. And this was allowed because her husband was supportive, because he actually encouraged her to do so in the face of criticism. She got criticism from other families who said, more or less, why are you letting your wife make a fool of herself, writing these things and disputing with philosophers? And they wouldn't generally let her, she couldn't attend the same social circles as the men who were doing this kind of work. But she sort of operated around that, and because her husband was supportive, she was allowed to do that. So that kind of woman did come up every once in a while from the noble class. Okay. Any other group of women who might have been able to achieve some status as an author?
Nuns?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, women who led the religious life, okay, because they separated themselves off as nuns. They were not going to be married as nuns. They often went into those cloisters at a very young age, and were educated by their fellow nuns to live the religious life. But this included, being able to read, being able to write, and so, some of the most famous authors from the Middle Ages who were women were nuns, right? Because they had the time, they had the education. Okay, and so some of those women, later on became saints, of course, too, in the process of doing that. So these were typically the avenues. If you were a woman, so that meant that if you were not in one of these two categories, you really couldn't do it for the most part. Okay, because most likely you would not have been, you may be not literate at all, or even if literate, uneducated. And in an atmosphere that was not supportive, okay? So for the most part, members, of course, women of the lower classes, but even women of the middle class, or the so-called bourgeois class, would not have been able to do this kind of work, which makes Christine a little bit unusual, because she's sort of on the edge of the nobility, and she sort of fell off the nobility at a certain point, but because she was associated with the noble class, she was still able to do her work. Just a little bit about Christine's life. These are her dates, so you see this is the early Renaissance period. Okay? Things are starting to change a little bit. And she was born in Italy, but she's known as a French poet and philosopher because she lived most of her life in France. She was at the French court of Charles V, and her father was the court astrologer. So he was not a member of the nobility himself, okay? But he was there at court, which gave him access to a lot of important people. So anybody know anything about astrology? What is astrology? But that's astronomy, okay? Astronomy is...
Using the stars to predict futures and stuff?
Yeah, right. It's not astronomy, which would be the study of outer space and, the serious study of the planets and stars and so forth. But you use the term predict, and that's the difference, is that there were many people throughout the Middle Ages who got this so-called science from the Muslims, okay, and developed it, and it was used to predict a variety of things. Okay. Now, does anybody read astrology charts and things like that? Okay, no one will probably admit it, but I mean, haven't you ever read your like personal forecast? You're a Scorpio. I'm a Scorpio, and it always says that I'm unpredictable, and actually, it's usually really wrong. But it's but I still, when I see it, I read it, right? And so when we use astrology today, what are we most likely trying to find out? What's it usually about? The what?
The future.
Yeah, you want to know the future. Maybe about money, right? Sometimes you want to know, am I going to make more money? Am I going to fall into some money? Sometimes it's about relationships, okay? So if you read these, it's usually about those two things. So you may think that her father was somebody who was sort of telling people at court their fortune, more or less. But that wasn't what he was doing for the most part, okay? Astrology was actually considered a serious science back then. Now we sort of play around with it, like tarot card readings, but very few people actually believe it. But back then, astrology was actually taught at universities. And in fact, there were some professions that you couldn't earn a degree in unless you had training in astrology, because it was considered to be, it was a true science. I mean, it wasn't by our standards, but that's the way people thought of it. So for instance, if you were going to be a medical doctor and you didn't know the influence of the stars on a person's health and you couldn't read that, you weren't qualified. There were universities who wouldn't let you get out with medical training without astrology. So it was deeply used in the field of medicine. They used it to predict the weather, okay? Kind of like the Farmer's Almanac, only more serious, right? That, try to predict the weather, try to predict, what the crops will be like, what you need to do to make them productive, etc. Okay? So for centuries, it was used in this way and was considered a science. But at the same time, the Christian religion sort of clashed with it. Can you see why? Okay, why? Does anybody want to tell me? Everybody seemed to think that was common sense, so why?
So I think it kind of goes counter to like what people would think is God's will, like not free will, but just knowing something that you shouldn't know.
Yeah. So trying to look into the future seems like you're usurping God's position. You're trying to do something godlike. Yeah, there's that, right? It seems kind of like presumptuous, perhaps. Okay.
Probably there's not a lot in the Bible. I'm not a biblical scholar by any means, but I'm thinking there's not a lot in the Bible that would support astrology as a science.
The Magi used the stars.
That's true. That's a good point. That's right. They did. They were astrologers in a sense, right? And they read the stars. That's a good point. Maybe somebody can think of another instance of that. Yeah. But the objection tended to be that, it was magic, that there was something occult about it, And so it kind of, there was an uneasy relationship between people's Christianity and astrology. But yet there was a pretty strong belief in astrology. And there were sometimes attempts to put the two together. God created everything. He created the stars as well, and perhaps, he allows us a pathway to knowledge through the stars, But it was problematic, okay? So I wanted to just talk about that a bit because it is a little bit of an unusual background. Your father's the astrologer, And as such, some interesting ideas would have been discussed probably at home, right? And even though astrology, the way we look at it now, it's not a science, it's not really a very serious subject, seems like superstition maybe to us, but to them it was an in-depth study. So at the very least, there was intellectual rigor in this household, there was curiosity, and because he was an astrologer at court, she would have had interaction with a lot of very interesting people, okay? And the indications are that she was allowed that this was a father who was not one who said, stay at home and we'll marry you off at 14 or something like that, although she did get married pretty young, at 15 actually. But, not the kind of father that basically hid his daughter away. So she was given a very good education, and that wouldn't have happened without a supportive father. All right? And at 15, she married Etienne de Castel, who was a secretary, the court secretary. Now, was that unusual? Not at all. Not at all. So we shouldn't think anything about getting married at 15. The standards were just different then. Okay? Why would you want to get married young back then? Yeah, your life expectancy was so much lower, right? You're going to die at 40 potentially, or 35, and you might die in childbirth too. And actually, the younger, the more likely that you would be able to have children and survive. So, it was a practical thing, in effect, to get married young. So, by all accounts, she loved her husband. This was not just some sort of arranged marriage, but was a romantic attachment. And when he died 10 years later, she was heartbroken. By then, she had 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. And financially, she got into trouble because although she should have inherited her husband's estate, women inheriting was not automatic, and there were family members of his who wanted that inheritance. And so they sued and tied up the estate so she didn't have access to his money. Okay? So suddenly here we have a woman who's been raised her whole life at court. She's used to a certain lifestyle. She's used to being treated with respect. But she's in a situation where she has no money. And it could have been devastating. And a lot of women could have just been basically put out, or maybe she would have ended up working for some, noble family as a secretary or a nanny or something like that, But what she did was kind of extraordinary. She decided that she would take a route that previously really only men had taken, which is to be sponsored by the elite with the works that she did. Okay? So, I mentioned Hobbes before. Hobbes is a great case of being supported. He was not a member of the noble class, but he was highly intelligent. And he latched on to a wealthy family, and they they supported him. Okay? They gave him a place to live, they gave him a salary, he performed certain functions, like for a certain time he tutored their children. But a lot of his day he was allowed to research and write his books, and the family, the Cavendishes, considered it an honor, a sort of, a mark of their own achievement that they sponsored somebody like Thomas Hobbes. Many of the great philosophers and artists and poets of previous centuries were sponsored in this way. Okay? It was the wealthy's way, the wealthy family's way of being involved in these things and being able to, it's a philanthropic thing, but also a status thing to support people like this. But obviously, for the most part, those people were men, okay? Scientists, artists, philosophers, and so forth. So when Christine started to make overtures to the effect that she wanted to be sponsored, she did have to go about it in a different way. And not everybody responded positively, but to her surprise, to maybe our surprise, a lot did. So what she did was, she would write poems. At first they were about her husband, her dead husband, and then later on they were about other subjects as well. But she would write these poems and give them as gifts to wealthy families, and the unspoken suggestion was that they provide her with some support in exchange for the poem or the gift. Okay. Another thing that she might have done, but I don't see any evidence that she did, is write poems or pieces specifically about members of the noble class. Some artists, of course, did this with great success, painting portraits of them and so forth. But she did not do that. But she was successful in getting support. So she started to, in other words, she worked for her money, although she was in that position because of her previous associations at court, right? Not just any woman could do this. Okay? But she was in this unique position of being known, of being respected already, okay? And even still, there were many people who thought this was inappropriate, that, who is she to be doing this? But some very famous people, including the Duke of Berry and Philip II of Burgundy, Queen Isabella, 4th Earl of Salisbury in England, these people all supported her. Okay? So with their help, with their financial help, she was able to continue to write poetry, and then she started to write prose. You don't need to remember all those names, but these are some very important people, right? All right, so after writing poems in memory of her dead husband, she began to write poetry about courtly love. Okay, so we need to understand that because it does become important in her story. Does anybody know what that means, courtly love? It's part of chivalry. No? Let's see. Has anybody read the story of Lancelot and Guinevere or seen a movie about it? And the Knights of the Round Table and all that? Okay. Remember the relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere? It was actually a little bit on the bad side because she was married. But no sex occurred between the two. That was perfectly clear because this was about courtly love. Okay? It's a particular view of love towards women that is usually chaste, which means sex is not the issue. But it's one of great admiration and devotion. So Lancelot, being a knight, loved Guinevere from afar. Okay? And, the purest form of courtly love would not make any sort of demands upon a female at all, whether married or single. Okay? But simply, love and adore the woman from afar, be her protector. Okay? So in tournaments, you know, the knight would roll up on his horse to take the token from the lady that he had pledged his love to, and then, you know, go about jousting for her. He was her champion. Okay? So what we know of courtly love is sort of from the movies about things like this. Chivalry involved a lot more than attitudes towards women, but what we think of it as sort of putting women on a pedestal, right? Which feminists later on decided we needed to get rid of because in their view, well, what, can anybody tell me what feminists think of chivalry? Of putting women up on a pedestal?
Well, they hate it.
Yeah, that's right. But why? What's bad about it? This is tough, isn't it?
Maybe because, like, I don't know, maybe it makes a distinction between men and women, and I don't know, way how you treat them. So I don't know.
And that's it. It makes a distinction between men and women, and it basically endorses the idea that men's role is different than women's role, and men's role is part of men's role is to protect women. Okay, so. Their reaction was, well, that makes it sound like women can't take care of themselves and they're more delicate and so forth and they need protection. But that protection, in their view, amounted to controlling of women, and so they rejected that. But by the time feminism rejected chivalry, chivalry was pretty, you know, it's a much weakened force anyway. Okay? But at this time, it was really, you know, a very strong current. Okay? And it was very tied up with Christianity and moral duty and so forth. And so when she wrote A Courtly Love, it was in a very positive way. Okay? She very much admired it, right? And she thought that you know, men should behave in this way. And it was a romantic notion too, you know, but also just the idea of protecting women, of treating women with dignity and respect. You know, being courteous to them. So this became important for her story because in the process of extolling chivalry and courtly love, she got into a dispute with a man, Jean de Meun, who wrote this book, Romance of the Rose, which tried to knock chivalry down by depicting women as using chivalry to manipulate men and really trying to show that women were seductresses at court and manipulators of men. And Christine saw this as a direct attack on the values of chivalry and on women. She saw it as an attack on women's character, and she saw it as a real threat to women's well-being. If a lot of men started thinking of women like this, then they would not treat them with respect. She disagreed with the way he depicted the way women talked and the way men talked to women in this piece with vulgar language and so forth. And she was all over that, okay? So while a lot of people would have agreed with Christine if Christine had been a man and said these things and defended chivalry and courtly love, the fact that she came out and said it led to some criticism of her, not just from him, but from others who said, well, you know, she's speaking out of turn and she's disputing with a man, and women don't do that. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, in her view, chivalry and courtly love didn't go hand in hand with not saying anything or not arguing with a man if necessary. So they said, you know, this isn't very ladylike, this isn't very womanly, we can't have women. I mean, can you understand how that could upset the apple cart? That we have a woman arguing with a man at this level. I mean, obviously arguments happen in homes all the time in private, but here we have a woman with some renown having an open public debate with a man. Okay, that could be sort of society changing. Okay, so I think that there was this worry, well, if Christine does this, then what will happen next? And so, I mean, just like when you change anything or you try to, sort of push anything a little bit beyond the traditional, she got some backlash from that and some criticism. But you can see why at her time. I mean, she was not interested in knocking down chivalry at all. She thought chivalry was something that protected women and gave them dignity, and that somebody like Joan was coming along and trying to destroy that, which would mean that they would be more vulnerable, that they would be treated with disrespect and so forth. So Christine is sort of sometimes written about as a proto-feminist, but when you really look at what she wrote, if feminism means a rejection of say, gender distinction, or if feminism means the rejection of chivalry, no, not at all. But if you mean by that just concern for women's status, then yes, okay, she definitely was. So here's some of her works of prose as opposed to poetry. Okay? The Book of the City of Ladies, where she actually featured examples from the past and present of particularly virtuous women. And this was a mirror book, as well as the next one. So she wrote several mirrors. And this one was designed to give women role models, basically. Okay. The Book of the Three Virtues discussed women's roles as they should be virtuously undertaken in the different classes, so the nobles, the middle, and the lower classes. Okay? She wrote an autobiography in which she attempted to defend herself further against people like Joan and her critics. And the Book of the Deeds and Good Morals of the Wise King Charles V. Now there's a book written directly for a person who could sponsor her, so that would be an exception to what I said before. Okay? So these were some of her works. She wrote 8 other prose works, and one which you can still look up, I think it's online, is the Song of Joan of Arc, where she wrote about the life of Joan of Arc, who certainly, busted through some, I guess, stereotypes about women. So you can see that she was very interested in the status of women. This was written after she retired to a convent after the Battle of Agincourt, when actually the French were roundly defeated, and a lot of nobles were killed. And so in the wake of that, she left for a convent, and she continued to write. Sorry about, you don't have to worry about writing every single word of this down. I just think that it's important to have this background so we really understand what a unique person this was. So now we can see this was a person who was truly a pioneer in literature by and for women. She wrote an awful lot just about women and women's role, and she tried to elevate the awareness of what we would now call women's issues of particular concern to women, including her own issue of support. What does an intelligent woman do who can contribute but no longer has the financial support from a family or from a husband? Okay? Society would be better off, in her view, if it supported women in this way to do this type of work as well. So we have a selection. What I asked you to read is from another mirror book called The Book of the Body Politic. And among the things that it does is further this, the body politic image. So you can kind of trace that through all the, the writers that we've looked at from the medieval period. And in it, she, again, discusses the proper role of the king or prince, the nobles, and the common people, which includes both the bourgeois, middle class, and the poor, the peasants. Okay? It's a mirror book. All right. And it's aimed at the French king and the nobles. So it also uses this, as I said, this body politic image. Okay? Remember, let's just kind of review this now. Who's in the body politic, who is the head?
King.
Right, the king is the head, right, because he thinks, and sometimes it can be the priest too, right? But in the typical case, it's the king. What about the arms and the hands?
Military.
Right, the military and also the administration. It can include the administration, so people who carry out different functions in the government, but definitely the military. And what about the belly, the legs, and the feet? Sometimes the belly is actually depicted as the king too. We've seen that, or members of the nobility. Okay. But what about the legs and the feet, typically? Yeah, they're the common people. They kind of carry everything along, right? So Christine uses this imagery too, and she adds her own little twist to it. And as you might predict, she's unconventional. Typically, medieval authors use this to say, you know, we need to respect the head. We need to, you know, because if the head does not direct and we, or the belly in some cases, if we disregard its needs, then everybody will die. That's kind of where we started out with this image. But now we have somebody who flips it around pretty much completely, okay? And the feet become the most important. And she's basically, through using this image, giving a warning. If you disregard the needs of the people, you will have a serious problem. So let's think about why she chose this image. Okay. For a soldier, why are the feet so important? Some of you guys ought to know this one.
You're not going to go anywhere if you can't use your feet.
Yeah, right. It's tantamount to survival to keep your feet in good health, right? You got to keep them dry, free from whatever the hell can affect your feet, and I'm sure that a lot can. So it's very, very important to keep them healthy so that you can escape from danger, so you can do your work. Okay? And if they are in poor shape, then you're going to be handicapped. You're not going to be able to maneuver. You're not going to be able to run away. You're not going to be able to do your work as necessary. Okay? So this is the way that she uses the image of the feet. Okay? They carry you along. If they don't work right, if they start to hurt or whatever, then you're going to be seriously handicapped. Okay? Now, there are 3 parts to this book. We're looking at part 3. But we have part 1 is about the king and his responsibilities. Part 2 is about the arms and hands, the knights and the nobles. And part 3 is about the common people, the feet. Okay, so that's how this works. Okay? And of course, the overall purpose of the image is to show that they all have to work together. I mean, that's always the message, right? There has to be harmony. All these parts have to work together. However, as I indicated, one part in particular needs special attention. Okay? So while she emphasizes unity, she very much emphasizes the importance of the feet. Okay, so I'll just read this rendition, which by now this should be so familiar to you, and it should be striking. Hopefully it's striking. These various authors that we've read all tell the same story. So this is truly iconic, or whatever you call it, archetypical. Okay, it's an archetype, you know, at this point. And so a very simple image, but it comes with a very strong message. So here's her rendition. She says, "Once upon a time there was great disagreement between the belly of the human body and its limbs. The belly complained loudly about the limbs and said that they thought badly of it and that they did not take care of it and feed it as well as they should. On the other hand, the limbs complained loudly about the belly. Okay, the belly is, I guess the king is the belly in this case again. And said that they were all exhausted from work. And yet despite all their labor, coming and going and working, the belly wanted to have everything and was never satisfied. The limbs then decided that they would no longer suffer such pain and labor, since nothing they did satisfied the belly. So they would stop their work and let the belly get along as best it might. The limbs stopped their work and the belly no longer nourished, so it began to get thinner and the limbs began to fail and weaken, and so, despite one another, the whole body died. So, sorry about that. I thought she just emphasized the feet, but she's talking about the limbs, so the hands and the feet are the people. So the lesson, she says, is likewise, when a prince requires more than a people can bear, then the people complain against their prince and rebel by disobedience. A little bit different than previous ones. Okay. So harmony is good, but when people in power abuse their position, the limbs, so to speak, the people, the feet and the hands, they just stop working, or they can stop working. And when that happens, the whole body can die. What would that be a reference to?
I don't know if this is what you're talking about. Maybe she's referencing like the body of, like the church body of Christ, like the hands and feet and the eyes and all work together.
I don't think so, but that's kind of a neat idea. It does have there's a correspondence there, the body of Christ, which is, one way of understanding that is that the people as a whole. So there might be something going on there with trying to remind people that they are all one body. That might be another reason for using this imagery. So that's a good suggestion. Yeah.
I mean, maybe like the idea of a social contract.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely that. I mean, again, we aren't at a point where these writers are going to use the contract type of language, but there's this, underlying notion here that people need to see the purpose of each other's functions. They need to be able to understand we're all in this together, and we all need to agree to each other's roles and so forth. So it's sort of, the beginning of social contract idea. And again, it's from this type of thing that we get those ideas later on, right? Because these authors start basically indicating that, the people are important. You can't ignore the people. The people are, in a sense, the purpose of the government. Protecting them is the duty of the government and so forth. So, and this reference to rebellion, again, we've had another author do this as well. William of Pagula basically made reference to the idea that the people could rebel. And she's suggesting they could stop working, okay? And if they do, then the prince will find out how important they are. Okay? Kind of reminds me, I showed a video I always show in my intro class about the collapse of communism. And in that, there's one of the first things that happened is the Polish uprising. And the Polish uprising was pretty effective. It got put down a little bit later on, but at first they were very, very successful. And one of the reasons was the workers figured out that they could just stop everything. They could just literally stop everything. They, the people who were train conductors just stopped their trains in the tracks and stopped all the shipments from coming and going. They basically stopped all commerce. So the shipyard workers stopped working. They stopped unloading, and everything just came to a halt. And these communist leaders had no recourse. What are they going to do? Kill everybody? Practicalities get in the way here. You have to have these people to run the country. So it made a very a major impact on them. They didn't know what to do. And they actually gave in and allowed these people to form a non-communist labor union. So you know, she's saying something very similar here. When people stop working, you will learn, if they do that, who's really actually more important in your country. Nothing will get done. And this empowers the people quite a bit. And the message, if ordinary people got this message, would be quite revolutionary. Okay, and probably another reason why Christine wasn't universally liked by members of the upper class is because she did have a little bit of a democratic bent, you know, a favoritism towards the people that probably was not always welcome. So this leads to a question which maybe we can work on next time too, which is if Christine favored the people and could see that they were maybe the most important element in the society because they did the work, then why didn't she make the leap to advocating democracy? Because she doesn't. Okay? She doesn't ever criticize the basic structure of the government with the king and the nobles at the top. Mm-hmm.
The only reason she was dependent on, their gifts and them supporting her, so she didn't want to, go too far as to insult all of them when she'd be on her own again.
Absolutely, yeah, right. These people were her supporters. Now imagine if somehow in France, of course this did happen much later, but somehow at her time in France, a revolution happened and a democratic government was instituted. How would Christine fare? Not too well. I mean, first of all, she'd be identified with the nobility because she'd been supported by them. But just from being a woman, I mean, the average man's understanding of what a woman should do was way worse than the average noble's understanding. You see what I'm saying? In other words, if you put, because in these days, of course, democracy meant men were in charge. And so the average man from the lower and middle class would be far more likely to be very, very sexist and unable to deal with any sort of change regarding women than a member of the noble class, because they were more educated, had more leisure, were not threatened by, to the same degree, not threatened by women. So ironically, a democratic revolution, not only then, but during the French Revolution, was bad for women, because most men did not want to give women any sort of freedom or rights. Okay? Not the way we normally think of it, but it's the truth. Okay? Democracy isn't always good for equal rights because it depends on who the majority, who can vote. Okay? It can be very bad. So I think that Christine not only could see what side her bread was buttered on, but more generally the implications of democracy for women, not necessarily. So she did know that there were different ways of running government, and she could have advocated for them, but she said, I believe that such governance is not the most profitable for the republic. And republic in this usage just means sort of government in this country, because it certainly wasn't a republic. And also it does not last very long once begun, nor is there growth or peace, and for a good reason. But I will not say more here for reasons of brevity. This is about democracy in particular. Okay? It does not last very long, nor is there growth or peace, and for good reasons. So she probably also had a bit of a notion that that the nobles were more qualified generally to handle law and order and foreign policy than the average person. So obviously the aristocratic bent is there as well. Okay. It'd be very difficult for Christine or most of the people that she associated with to imagine that the common man could be better at those things or could handle those types of issues well. So instead, she does support the system basically the way it is, and her job, as she sees it, is to remind people of their duties and responsibilities, and that the people of the upper classes need to pay attention to and take care of the lower classes and recognize their true importance, but this doesn't translate into democracy. as I said, later on it does. I mean, more and more this way of thinking pushes people towards more democratic thought. And this was not necessarily good for women at first. No, it wasn't. Okay. Over time, you know, women had to kind of claim rights in that new system. And it took a long time to do so.